woke enveloped by the damp cold of a makeshift barracks, the rancid smell of wet straw assaulting your nostrils as the hard earth beneath your bare feet seemed to draw away any hint of warmth. Your breath formed small clouds in the heavy morning air, and the dragged footsteps of your weary comrades echoed distantly along the narrow corridor. Your muscles ached from a night poorly slept, and you smoothed the rough sleeve of your kimono, feeling the persistent itch no washing could erase. Even before the sun rose, you knew the day ahead would be an endless parade of repetitive chores, sharpening the spear's blade, carefully assembling battle gear, and, amid it all, sustaining your body against the silent gnaw of hunger and the diseases that lurked near the camp. Preparing the scant rice, watching for signs of illness among the men, and preventing weakness were as vital as standing firm on the front lines. Each movement felt heavy, weighed down by an exhaustion that refused to lift. But the simple ritual of serving your daimyo bitter tea approached, a moment which, despite its calm, could seal your fate. The monotony of routine lulled you, just like the constant whisper of survival amid the dust and silence of war. The barracks silence that winter morning in 1582 carried a peculiar weight, a cold promise gripping your skin before dawn. Outside, the gray sky stretched endlessly, muted like spilled ink upon parchment, while faint, hoarse murmurs drifted through the fog. You noticed the smell of damp wood mingled with the stale scent of smoke settling from the night before. A brittle chill nudged your senses awake, a far cry from the modern complaints of a dying phone battery or a sluggish Wi-Fi connection. Here, your body rebelled against the cold and hunger without the silent charger or comforting digital distraction. You lowered yourself to the floor, your bare feet pressing into the cold dirt, uneven and unyielding. Fingers clasped the worn spear, tracing the cold metal edge. Slowly, methodically, you began the act of sharpening, metal against stone, each stroke a deliberate whisper of defiance against decay. The rough texture of the whetstone, damp with use, pressed into your palms. You felt the rhythm, forward, back, a steady murmur that matched your slowed heartbeat. Between strokes, you wiped sweat from your brow, the rough fabric of your sleeve bristling against ragged skin. Then came the familiar task of assembling armor and equipment, leather straps stiff from dampness, buckles cold and reluctant. You adjusted each piece carefully, mindful of the smallest detail would be restricted or freed by each strap's tension. The rice awaited too, scarce and dull, boiled, portioned, and swallowed, with the immediate hope of staving off the gnawing emptiness within. These tasks fell like soft mantras, each step a beat in the steady cadence of survival. A sudden hush fell over the camp. The usual low murmur vanished as if swallowed by the mist itself. Even the dogs stopped barking. Eyes briefly met across the campfire's wan glow, an unspoken tension thickening the air like smoke. Something unseen but palpably close stirred beneath the routine's fragile calm. You held your breath, the silence ringing louder than any clash of swords. The day's heavy chore list faded, replaced by a watchfulness sharper than any blade. Hey, before Morpheus takes you completely, give a quick check if you're still subscribed. Sometimes the button disappears, and I don't want you to miss the next bedtime stories. Take a soft-like pillow moment to leave a like. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Your interaction keeps this calm little corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. You remain still, every muscle tight beneath the coarse threads of your kimono. The faintest shift, enough to disturb the brittle silence. The chill clung to your skin like a second layer, seeping between the gaps in the rough fabric. Your breath still hung visible before you, mingling with a faint mist that hovered just above the earth. The damp straw underfoot rustled faintly with the cautious motions of your fellow soldiers nearby, like whispers just beyond reach. The air was dense, heavy with unspoken anticipation. Every sound seemed magnified, the soft scraping of stone against metal as another man honed his blade. The distant call of a crow breaking through the fog. The dull thud of a wooden bucket set down too abruptly near the edge of the camp. You felt the repetitive pull of exhaustion tightening deep within your limbs, a slow drag that dulled the edges of thought and movement alike. Yet your hands knew their work, moving with practiced slowness, drawing the whetstone across the spear's edge again and again. You felt the gritty surface rasp over the metal, smoothed slightly with each stroke, echoing the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. Outside the fragile walls of the barracks, the world remained cloaked in muted grays. The sky overhead was a vault of unyielding stone, pressing down with a quiet, suffocating weight. A sluggish wind stirred the smoke, drifting from last night's dying fire, curling thinly between hollowed tree trunks. You caught the faint scent of damp earth, layered over with the sharp sting of cold metal and smoke, smells that pressed into memory like shadows that would not fade. Your fingers trembled as you lifted a tattered piece of leather, worn thin from years of use, and began to fasten it carefully along the front of your armor. The straps resisted, stiff and unyielding from exposure to moisture and cold, biting into the tender skin of your wrists. You paused, brushing away a small bead of sweat, though the cold kept your skin clammy. The rough texture against your fingertips was a stark reminder. Survival hinged on these small preparations, the weight of each piece settling slowly onto your shoulders, constricting yet steadying. A distant murmur rippled through the camp, like a breath held too long, the low hum rising and fading with the chill wind. You sensed the wary glances that flickered like fleeting shadows over the familiar faces nearby, shadows etched with the same quiet dread that tightened your chest now. The routine you counted on wavered beneath an unseen tension, a tremor beneath the surface of stillness. Even the dogs seemed drawn into the silence, their restless paws muted against the hardened ground. You moved to fetch the meager portion of rice set aside for you, the polished grains dull and lifeless in your worn bowl. The warmth was slight, fleeting, but it brought a momentary comfort against the gnawing hunger that clawed at your insides. Each bite was deliberate, slow, savored more for its ritual than its flavor. You chewed steadily, the brittle texture crumbling beneath your tongue, as your eyes flicked to the camp's edge, where outlines blurred between mist and shadow. The sharp scent of smoke grew thicker, a warning carried on the breath of the wind. You tightened your grip on the spear, feeling the cold steel bite into your palm, grounding you. Without thought, you stepped toward the narrow corridor leading from the barracks, the coarse earth crunching softly beneath your bare feet. The dim light filtered weakly through gnarled branches overhead, creating a patchwork of trembling shadows that danced uneasily at your periphery. Your senses sharpened with every slow, cautious step. The texture of the air changed, a dampness thick with something older, darker. The distant whistle of the wind carried an edge of sorrow and threat, as if the very world dared to whisper secrets better left unheard. Your pulse quickened, but your feet remained steady, following the familiar path between walls of mud and rough-hewn timber. As you rounded a corner, the quiet was shattered by a subtle clink, metal brushing against stone, so faint you almost missed it. You froze, every nerve alert, listening to the restless silence that clawed back immediately. The stillness felt heavier here, the shadows deeper. The cold seeped deeper into your bones. You reached out instinctively, brushing your palm against the surface of a weathered wooden beam, its splintered edges sharp beneath your skin, solid and real amidst the haze of uncertainty. The familiar texture tethered you for a moment, grounding your swirling senses. You exhaled slowly, the mist catching and dissolving your breath like a fleeting ghost. The low murmur from the camp faintly returned, a soft pulse beneath the thick blanket of quiet. Your thoughts strained against the pressure of the unknown. What waited beyond these walls? What drew the silence tight like a noose? Your body tensed, the weight of exhaustion trembling faintly beneath the primal surge of alertness rising through your veins. Yet clarity flickered in the cold morning light, a spark of resolve born from the steady, measured steps you took, and the ancestral rhythms echoed in every precise motion. A faint light breathed through a narrow crack in the wooden slats ahead. A lane of pale sunshine, spilling hesitantly onto the frozen earth like a tentative promise. You felt its warmth before you saw it, a soft pulse that whispered, a fleeting comfort amid relentless gray. But the moment passed, and shadow crept quickly back over the world, pulling the light into darkness as if reluctant to let hope linger. You glanced back once toward the fragile glow of the campfire, still smoldering faintly at the center of your world. Faces blurred in the low haze, bodies stooped and still, caught between sleep and wakefulness. The routine, a line of chores, pauses, the careful balance of strength and surrender, awaited. Yet, beneath it all, the unease persisted. The quiet had changed, thickened. Something unseen prowled close, just beyond reach. The sharp, metallic scent of blood, or maybe fear, teased the edges of your senses, a faint tingle against the cold. You advanced again, knowing the invisible weight pressed harder with each step. Then, through the silence, a distant crack, the subtle splintering of wood, slow and deliberate, broke the stillness like a whispered warning. You stopped, heart tightening against your ribs, breath caught in a moment, stretched thin between the life you held and the silent threat that drew near. You held your breath, each muscle taut beneath the rough fabric of your kimono, the silence pressing in on you like cold stone. The faint click of wood splintering haunted the stillness, reverberating softly through the dense, damp air. Your eyes strained toward the narrow corridor's end, where shadows shifted with a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. The chill deepened, seeping into your very bones as you took the smallest step forward, your bare foot sinking slightly into the frozen earth. It yielded beneath you with a muted crunch, sending a fragile sound that felt loud enough to shatter glass in the pervasive quiet. The roughness of the ground mirrored the grit in your hands as you gripped the spear anew, the cold metal, solid and reassuring against your palm. Your breath unfurled before you in steady puffs, mingling with the thin mist that crawled low across the earth. The dim morning light filtered through the leafless branches above, fractured like shards of gray glass pinned in the sky. There, between the cracked wooden slats, a thin thread of wind whispered low, threading through the camp with a voice that seemed ancient, laden with warning. Your heart beat slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm of the whetstone grinding faintly inside, somewhere deeper in the barracks. You tried to tune into that steady sound, as though it might anchor your scattered senses. Another measured step, slow and careful, brought you closer to the source of the faint disturbance. The air thickened with the scent of smoke once more, not clean and settling, but sharp and biting, curling beneath your nose, like the memory of a flame long extinguished. You noted how the cold air clung stubbornly to the damp leather straps of your armor, tightening around your wrists as your fingers moved with deliberate slowness, fastening each buckle as if securing your own resolve. Nearer now, your ears picked up the subtle shift, a faint rustle as something soft brushed against rough timber, quick and elusive. Your fingers brushed against the wall. To steady yourself, the wood splintered and worn smooth by time, its texture a grounding presence amidst the restless silence. The cold bitterness of the morning seeped through every crack, filling your lungs with the taste of earth and hidden things. Your gaze flicked to the edges of the camp, where shadows pooled and swayed in indecipherable patterns. You could feel the fragile veil between safety and threat fraying, stretched thin by anticipation. The distant murmur of your comrades had all but faded, swallowed by the creeping fog that wrapped the camp in its clammy embrace. Even the dogs, usually restless at dawn's stirring, lay still now, their breaths shallow and slow. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur rose in the distance, threading through the silence, like a warning carried on the wind. You paused, chest tightening, as the soft sound faded and was replaced by a heavy, almost tactile stillness. Your hands shook slightly as you raised the spear, the weight cold and sharp, a relic of discipline and survival. You dare not glance back. The narrow path ahead beckoned, unknown and unyielding. Each step forward was a careful dance of senses. The damp earth underfoot lent an unsteady grip, slick with the residue of frost and decay. Tiny droplets hung suspended from brittle twigs, glistening faintly before surrendering to the slow pull of gravity. You noticed the smell then, a coppery tang carried faintly on the breeze, mingling with the bitter smoke and heavy dampness. It was a scent that pried at your instincts, whispering of fresh wounds and silent watchers. Your breath hitched, every hair stood on edge, the prickling chill crawling upward, threading through nerve and sinew like a whispered secret. You felt the pulse of something unseen, the slow and measured tread of shadow just beyond sight. You willed your body still, every move deliberate, as you crouched briefly, touching the cold earth with a hesitant hand. The texture was gritty, stubbornly real, grounding you amidst the fragile uncertainty. The sky above dimmed further. A heavy gray veil draped low, as if the world itself was holding back, waiting. A flicker of light broke the monotony, a slender shaft of sun piercing through the mist like a fragile thread of gold. You reached out instinctively, pretending to brush it with your fingertips, savoring its faint warmth before the shadow swallowed it once more. Ahead, a narrow window let in a sliver of pale light, cutting a sharp line across the packed dirt. Something moved within that faint glow, a flicker, a breath, no more. Your heartbeat caught, thudding sluggishly in your chest as you narrowed your eyes. The faintest sound followed, a soft shifting, a whisper of cloth or leather against wood, faint but steady, drawing the silence taut. You swallowed the tightening fear that curled in your gut, steadying your grip on the spear's shaft. The moment stretched infinitely, the cold air crackling with a silent tension, so delicate it might break with the slightest breath. Then, just as quietly, the shadow moved again, a slow drift, deliberate and without haste, stepping around the corner with a smoothness that belied its menace. Your muscles tensed as the outline became clearer, a form not quite human in its cautious grace. It paused, a heartbeat of stillness, then vanished into the deeper twilight beyond. The world held its breath, time pulsing in slow, suspended beats between the fading light and creeping dark. You exhaled sharply, barely daring to trust the sound. That the silence had frayed beyond repair. Somewhere beyond the thin walls and fading fires, the calm was broken. The coming hours would carry more than routine. You felt it beneath the fabric of the morning, a quiet on the brink, watchful, patient, and unavoidable. And as the shadow slipped away into the mist, the heavy stillness around you dissolved into a whispered urgency, a faint heartbeat echoing closer. You held your breath, muscles coiled beneath the rough fabric of your kimono, as the heavy silence swelled around you like thick fog. The splintering sound had receded, folding back into the oppressive quiet, yet the echo hung stubbornly in the damp air, a faint tremor beneath your skin that refused to settle. Your eyes traced the shifting shadows along the narrow corridor, where the dull light carved jagged patterns against the weathered planks, trembling like fragile promises of escape. The cold clung to you, a persistent weight that seeped deeper with every shallow breath. You could taste the metallic sting of the air, sharp and biting, a reminder of wounds both seen and unseen, etched into the bones of the earth beneath your feet. The damp straw muffled the faint scrapes and shifts from nearby soldiers, whose careful movements whispered through the barracks like subdued ghosts. The heavy cloak of anticipation wrapped tight, pressing into your lungs with each slow inhale. Your fingers tightened around the spear's shaft, the familiar ridges of cold metal grounding your wavering thoughts. The steady rhythm of your heartbeat matched the faint noise of the whetstone somewhere behind, its muted rasp, a quiet defiance against the encroaching decay of the morning. Every motion was deliberate, measured. The ritual of readiness played out in slow sequences. First, the tightening of a strap, then a careful glance over your shoulder, searching the stillness for any sign, any flicker of change. A soft breeze slid through the gaps in the wooden walls, curling thinly around your arms and stirring the rough strands of your hair. It carried with it a blend of scents, the acrid bite of smoke, faint and soot-darkened, the damp earth's musty perfume, tinged with a trace of cold metal and something wilder, less identifiable, but no less menacing. The fog hung low, wrapping the camp in a shroud that blurred edges and swallowed shapes, leaving only outlines, half-formed, shifting like shadows in a dream you could barely hold. You stepped slowly forward, bare feet, silent, but for the soft protest of cold dirt pressing beneath. Each movement was a careful negotiation with the chilled earth, uneven and unforgiving, every pebble and root a hesitant whisper against. Assaults. The tension knotted deeper in your muscles, a taut wire stretched thin beneath the habitual exhaustion that weighed your limbs down like chains made of lead. Yet you moved, driven by a pulse as ancient as the blood in your veins, the instinct to survive, to endure the relentless grind of war and waiting. At the tunnel's bending edge, your fingertips grazed the splintered wood, its rough texture grounding your racing senses. The grain felt like cold veins beneath your palm, steady and real among the shifting uncertainty. Your breath came out slow and misted in front of you, a ghost caught briefly in the morning chill before dissolving into the gray expanse. Somewhere behind, the faint stir of movement whispered through the camp. Shuffling steps, a low murmur, the careful adjustment of armor's uneasy embrace. The distant call of a crow cut through the fog. Sharp and solitary, an ancient sentinel staking its claim in the cold dawn. Your eyes flicked toward the faint glow of the campfires, thin veils of smoke twisting toward the heavy sky, carrying with them the long shadow of last night's embers. The faces around the fire were blurred halos of worn flesh and weary eyes, caught somewhere between sleep and waking, their silence speaking volumes in the cold. Your chest tightened as a sudden shift rippled through the air, a subtle disturbance, a slackened tension, like the moment just before a bowstring snaps. The scent of smoke thickened, turning acrid and fierce, burning the throat with a quiet promise of flames unspoken. Instinct curled in your gut, sharp and insistent, a warning carried in the whisper of cold wind moving through hollow spaces. A slow tightening gripped your hands, fingers flexing and unclenching around the spear's shaft as you prepared for whatever shadow lurked just beyond sight. You edged forward again, the earth beneath crumbling softly as your bare feet pressed into the frozen dirt. Closer now, your attention sharpened to each sound, the faint scrape of leather against wood, the muted clink of metal buckles resisting the cold, the near imperceptible rustle that quickened the pulse in your throat. Your senses sharpened to every detail, every fractured scent and half-glimpsed shape in the fog's unyielding grasp. The narrow window at the corridor's end caught a flicker of pale light, a sliver of dawn, threading through like a sudden cut in the gloom. You reached out instinctively, hand brushing tentatively against the rough timber, savoring the fragile warmth carried on that slender beam. But shadow curled around it relentlessly, pulling warmth back into cold absence. Your breath slowed, steadying as the quiet crept back. Thick, suffocating. A heavy silence pregnant with unspoken threats. Suddenly, the tight stillness shattered. A single footfall, soft, deliberate, touched the ground beyond the bend, steady and measured, like the heartbeat of shadow sensing your own. You froze, muscles taut, beneath worn fabric, every nerve bristling with cold fire. The faintest brush of movement flickered there, a figure slipping through darkness, blurred and cautious. No sound betrayed its full form, only the slow sliding of cloth, the whisper of leather in contact with wood. Your pulse thundered in your ears, drowning out the faint murmur of comrades nearby. The weight of this moment pressed in, stretching time into endless threads of tense expectancy. The figure paused, just barely visible, as if caught between worlds. Then, as quietly as it came, it slipped away again, swallowed by the thick haze. You exhaled sharply, breath shaking, but controlled, every sense straining toward the void left behind. The quiet was broken. The fragile shell of routine cracked wide open. Somewhere beyond, the camp had already shifted, the shadows stirring with purpose. The coming hours would be different from all before, etched with whispers of danger that had finally slipped past the edge of silence. And as the gray mist thickened once more, swallowing the trail of shadow's passage, you stood alone, a cold steel in your hand, a thin line between the dawn's fragile mercy and the darkness that waited to close in. The shadow vanished into the gray mist as silently as it had appeared, leaving the cold corridor emptied of movement, but charged with a thick, lingering tension. Your breath lingered in the air, a pale, trembling mist that seemed to dissolve slower now, weighed down by the heavy quiet. The faint scrape of your footsteps on the crushed earth felt a cacophony in the stillness. Each step stretched deliberately, as if slowing time might steady your racing heart. You moved forward cautiously, the spear's cold metal biting into your palm, rough and sure, an anchor amid the fragile uncertainty. The dampness clung to your skin through the threadbare fabric of your kimono, a slow seep that chilled deeper with each measured breath. The sharp scent of smoke had faded, but left its ghost, a smokiness beneath the damp earth's musk that seemed to settle in your lungs like a forgotten memory. Ahead, the wooden planks of the barracks creaked softly beneath a tentative wind, their uneven edges smoothed by years of use, pressing closely around the narrow path you followed. You reached out and brushed a calloused fingertip against one of the beams, rough, splintered, unyielding, solid beneath your touch, as though reminding you that some things remained constant, even when silence spoke louder than voices. A distant murmur from the camp surfaced briefly. Low voices, careful and terse, flickering like fragile sparks. Your ears strained to catch a word, a hint, anything that might pierce the dense fog of tension tightening around your chest. But the voices were swallowed as soon as they came, retreating with the wind's insistent sigh. Your gaze drifted to the shadowed edges where the campfire's faint, dying tendrils still clung stubbornly to life, sparks that refused to yield to the cold. The glow cast soft halos over discarded weapons and slumped figures, like ghostly guardians of a fading world. You felt the weight of eyelids growing heavy, your muscles aching with the slow burn of fatigue, wrapped tight beneath your armor's constrictive embrace. The cold earth beneath your bare feet crunched faintly, shards of frost breaking beneath. Your careful steps, each grain of dirt, each scuffed stone, felt magnified, a quiet pulse in your senses, slow and grinding. You breathed deeply, tasting the sharp tang of metal, earth, and fading warmth where ashes still whispered of fire. As you pressed onward, the narrow corridor broadened slightly, opening into a small clearing ringed with gnarled trees, whose leafless branches clawed at the pale sky. The fog curled low over the ground here, curling like slow fingers slipping between tangled roots and fallen leaves. A brittle wind traced the contours of your face, carrying with it the distant cry of a crow, sharp and solitary, echoing across the heavy gray expanse. You felt a subtle shift in the air, like the wrap of a fragile veil briefly disturbed, just as a faint, nearly invisible movement flickered in the corner of your vision. Your head turned slowly, muscles taut, eyes narrowing to catch the difference between shadow and substance. A slight breeze stirred the coarse fabric of your kimono as a shape slipped away behind a thick trunk, disappearing into the mist like smoke dissolving into the sky. Your heart thundered softly, a steady drum beneath the quiet shroud. The invisible threat pressed closer now, threading its cold breath against the back of your neck. Your fingers tightened around the spear, each knuckle pale as you drew strength from its solid presence. In the clearing center, the weak light of dawn crept through a ragged break in the clouds, painting the earth with strokes of muted gold. Soft, hesitant light melting slowly into the frost-hardened soil. You reached out, eyes following a stray beam as it wavered, illuminating frost crystals that shimmered like tiny stars caught in the grass. The beauty was quiet, almost imperceptible. A brief reprieve beneath the steady undertone of unease that wrapped your thoughts like fog. The clearing seemed to hold its own breath, the stillness both a sanctuary and a cage. You stepped lightly forward, your bare feet sinking faintly into the mossy ground that had escaped the frost's grasp. The faint sound of your movement, soft scrape of earth, the whisper of fabric, filled the silence, a fragile heartbeat in the vast, cold expanse. Suddenly, a sharp crack, no louder than a twig snapped beneath weight, shattered the fragile calm. Your body tensed instantly, muscles tightening in careful response. Your eyes scanned the space between the skeletal trees, catching the faintest shimmer, a sliver of movement as something slid between shadows, slipping closer, deliberate and smooth. You held your breath again, every sense honed to a razor's edge. The cool metal in your grasp seemed to hum faintly, responding to the tension that coiled inside you. The thick mist wavered, folding and reshaping, swallowing the shape and spitting out silence only moments later. Beyond the clearing, near the camp's edge, whispered murmurs rose anew, more confident now, edged with urgency. You sense the flicker of torches igniting, their soft flames painting the mist with flickering embers of orange and gold. The day's vast monotony strained against an unseen rhythm, each moment pregnant with the promise of change. Your pulse slowed slightly, nerves still taut beneath weariness, as your eyes settled on a narrow path leading deeper into the wilderness, a corridor between shadow and light. A strange quiet wrapped around it, almost reverent, waiting. The frost-hardened earth there was unmarred by footprints, untouched, mysterious, warning. The cold wind whispered again, threading through the branches like a sibilant voice. You felt it brush past your skin, carrying with it a scent unfamiliar and sharp, a mingling of pine, damp stone, and something darker beneath. It pried at your instincts, a silent invitation and a warning wrapped in one. For a heartbeat, your gaze lingered there, a silent question hanging in the frosty morning air. The spear in your hand felt suddenly heavier, not with weight, but with consequence. Then, as the first heavy clouds began to shift, spilling uncertain light over the camp, a subtle noise, just beyond hearing, rippled through the mist, and silent peril alike. And somewhere, just beyond sight, the answer awaited. You stood motionless, the cold pressing into your skin as if it sought to burrow deeper still. Every shallow breath painted small clouds before you, drifting upward and vanishing like forgotten secrets in the gray morning air. The spear shaft grounded your fingers, its chill seeping slowly into your bones, steadying the tremors that whispered doubt at the edges of your mind. The faint crack in the wooden beam behind the corner replayed itself in your thoughts with a lingering echo you could not shake. Ahead, the corridor stretched, narrowing into uncertain depths, where shadow and light tangled like restless spirits refusing rest. Your bare feet rested softly on the frozen earth, each slightly uneven grain pressing insistently against your soles. The cold roughness was a silent drum beneath the chorus of muffled sounds. Distant breaths, a soft scrape of cloth, the weightless settling of the fog wrapping the camp in its damp embrace. Every noise was a thread in this fragile tapestry of quiet unease. You shifted your weight slowly, cautious not to break the brittle silence. Your fingers flexed against the spear's rough wood, tracing the cool, familiar lines. Each moment was a slow brushstroke, painted in muted grays and droning silences, a rhythm of deliberate restraint. The tension in your shoulders eased just enough to remind you of the weariness that clung like a second skin, the long nights and endless routine settling deep in every muscle. The faint scent of smoke curled through the air again, sharper this time, acrid and persistent, as though the night's fire had not fully yielded to the dawn. It carried beneath it a bitter tang of iron and earth, a reminder of battles fought not with clashing steel, but with patience and silent endurance. You inhaled carefully, the cold air filling your lungs with the mingled memories of frost and flame. Nearer now, the outline of a narrow window caught the faintest gleam of dawn, a slender shaft of pale light piercing the heaviness like a fragile breath of hope. You stepped lightly toward it, the frozen dirt crunching ever so softly beneath your feet, and reached out, fingertips brushing the jagged edges of the wooden frame. The texture was splintered, cruel beneath your touch, grounding you with its stubborn reality amid the shifting shadows. Your eyes traced the faintest movement beyond, a figure, blurred and cautious, force, but of the patient, watchful kind that lurks unseen. You swallowed the tightening knot of vigilance, your grip on the spear unyielding. A low, distant murmur rose somewhere deeper within the camp. It was tentative at first, like a breath held too long, then growing, threading its subtle urgency through the fog. Your comrades stirred quietly, the rustle of fabric and soft thuds melding with the scent of cold firewood and damp straw. Yet no eyes met yours, no words broke the spell of waiting. The camp held its collective breath, suspended between weariness and the edge of something yet to come. You stepped back gently, turning away from the window and the lingering whisper of movement, the cold biting sharper as the morning stretched its limbs reluctantly. The walls around you felt closer somehow, the worn planks pressing in with their rough grain, and narrow gaps where slivers of frost gathered like fragile jewels. The sharp tang of metal lingered under your nails, a tactile reminder of the spear's promise and the weight it carried beyond mere wood and iron. The corridor widened slowly into a small clearing veiled in mist, where gnarled branches reached like twisted hands toward the restless sky. Your feet sank slightly into the moss that had guarded itself from the frost's cruel hand, soft and muted beneath the harsh reality of the world you inhabited. The wind whispered through the leafless crowns above, a cold susurration full of secrets you were not yet meant to hear. A single crow's cry shattered the quiet, brief and solitary, slicing sharply through the dampened sounds. You turned instinctively, bones taut beneath your kimono, and caught the faintest shift just beyond the edge of your vision. A shadow slipped behind a tree, moving with a smoothness born of careful patience. You felt the cold breath of danger graze your neck, fleeting, like the faint brush of silk against skin. Your hands trembled barely as your gaze locked on the narrow path, veering deeper into the wild embrace of the forest. The earth there lay untouched, unmarred by footprints or signs, a solemn invitation wrapped in shadow and silence. A low pulse beat within you, the ancient rhythm of survival echoing faintly against the encroaching dark. Beneath the pale glow of dawn, frost crystals glittered faintly among withered leaves, catching the fragile light like tiny stars caught in a frozen net. You knelt briefly, fingers trailing across the brittle grass, the texture sharp and real, grounding your swirling thoughts. The faint warmth of the fading fire behind you was a distant ember, a fragile reminder of life held at the edge of cold oblivion. The murmur of the camp whispered anew, edged now with a tension sharper than before. A quiet preparation, the unspoken promise of change pressing through the cold air like a tightening wire. You rose slowly, the spear feeling suddenly heavier, laden not with physical weight, but with the silent consequences that slumbered beneath every breath. Then, from the depths of the mist, came a sound, delicate, deliberate, a soft knock, gentle but tinged with urgency, tapped against the weathered wood of the barricade. Once, twice, before fading into the frozen silence like a heartbeat swallowed by shadow. You halted, muscles locked, and breath caught as the world seemed to hold itself still, hanging on the thin thread of that quiet summons. The coming dawn carried with it a whispered reckoning, and beyond the veil of mist, something stirred, patient and inexorable, just waiting for the moment you could no longer turn away. You stood rooted, the cold burrowing deeper, as the fragile knock against the wood dissolved into the thick silence. The air held its breath, heavy and still, weighed down by the fragile tension that lingered like frost clinging stubbornly to the barren branches above. Your breath hovered before you, a faint mist that felt slower now, as if time itself had thickened, drawn taut like the bowstring straining beneath unseen fingers. The wooden walls around you creaked ever so softly, as if settling beneath invisible weight, their rough grain a tactile contrast to the smooth metal pressed firmly in your grasp. Every fiber of your being was attuned, each nerve a thread trembling against the chill that seeped through the coarse fabric of your kimono. Your bare feet touched the ground with measured care, the cold earth unyielding, yet alive beneath the subtle crunch that echoed softly in the corridor. A faint whisper of wind curled through a gap overhead, threading its way through the narrow slats like a cautious serpent. It carried scents, damp wood, lingering ash, and that sharp sting of cold metal mingled with something darker, something not quite tangible, but pressing against the edges of your senses. The quiet murmur of the camp lay just beyond, voices subdued, breaths slow and purposeful amid the creeping tendrils of fog. You took a slow breath, steadying yourself as your fingers flexed around the spear's shaft. The cold so raw, it felt like contact with something eternal. The faint rasp of a whetstone still echoed softly behind you, a steady rhythm that grounded you in stillness, defying the silent storm gathering beyond. The walls. Your eyes sought the slender crack of dawnlight bleeding through the gaps in the timber. The faint gold slipping silently across the rough earth. Footsteps, distant and deliberate, stirred the stillness, a draft of movement weaving through the fog like a whispered threat. Your attention sharpened with the slow unfolding of instinct. Each sound was a pulse, every breath a fragile promise. You pressed forward, each step measured. The cold biting deeper into your skin through the threadbare kimono. The crunch of dirt beneath your feet was quiet now, a muted conversation between earth and flesh in the muted light. The narrow corridor stretched before you, winding like a hesitant path through shadow and cold, flanked by skeletal branches pressing their gnarled fingers against the sky. The mist curled and shifted, wrapping tendrils lightly around your ankles. Threading through the creases of your clothing, you felt the weight of the silence settling between moments, a thick presence that whispered caution and patience. As you moved, the faint brush of leather against wood caught your ear, a slow, cautious slide that made your heartbeat quicken beneath the steady calm. Your hand brushed the worn timber of a post, the splintered texture biting slightly into your fingertips, the roughness grounding you amidst the drifting haze of uncertainty. The cold air flooded your lungs, sharp with the scent of earth and smoke, heavy with the promise of things unseen. Ahead, a narrowing patch of pale light emerged through a thin window slit, the fragile dawn bleeding in like a hesitant breath. You paused there, fingertips tracing the jagged edges of the wood frame, the splintered grain a solid contrast to the fading shadows. Beyond, vague shapes flickered briefly, shadows shifting with slow grace, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable in their deliberate motion. Your breath caught. The rising murmur of the camp trembled beneath the lingering fog, voices faint and careful like whispers carried on wind. You sensed the shared unease of your comrades, their vigilance threading through the crisp air as the world seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of unfolding fate. A sudden crack snapped sharply, the sound of wood yielding under pressure, slicing through the fragile calm. Your body tensed instinctively, every muscle coiled beneath the rough fabric. The cold steel in your grip seemed to hum in response, its presence a thin border between what was known and the looming unknown. Shadows twisted, a shape melted through the mist with quiet, measured steps that betrayed neither haste nor panic. You narrowed your gaze, heart steady despite the tightening steel in your chest. The figure slipped just beyond your sight, fluid, patient, enveloped in the mist as if part of it, moving in tandem with the cold breaths of the morning. The heavy fog softened its edges, and when it disappeared behind a tree, A breath of silence followed, weighty and profound. The scattered glow of dying embers from faint campfires cast flickering halos that danced and stretched into the encroaching dawn, painting the frost with soft warmth before retreating into shadow. You lingered on that warmth, brief and fragile, as the world around you seemed to pulse with quiet urgency. The narrow path ahead beckoned, untouched, silent, and veiled in chilling mystery. The moss-kissed earth beneath your feet softened slightly with each careful step, the contrast of life and decay whispering beneath the cold. You inhaled deeply, tasting the mingled scents of pine resin, cold stone, and a darker fragrance that teased at the edge of your memory, an unspoken promise or a veiled warning. A breath of wind stirred the skeletal branches, sending a trail of frost crystals sparkling faintly like distant stars caught in a frozen net. The quiet is profound. The moment stretched thin like the thread of a spider's web, shimmering with dew. The camp's murmur grows, tentative but persistent, threading urgency through the gathering stillness. Then, the unmistakable sound, a deliberate, slow tap, sharp enough to pierce the quiet, but softened by the thick mist. It came again, precise and measured, once, twice. A quiet summons, the language of shadow and wood, echoing faintly through the cold dawn. You stood unmoving, each breath shallow, as every pulse reverberated through the frozen air. The cold was no longer merely outside, but now a presence that wrapped around your nerves and thoughts alike. Through the mist, a subtle movement stirred, a faint outline that blurred and wavered in the uncertain light. There, just beyond reach, something waited, patient, watching, and inexorably closing in. You stood motionless, the cold persisting like an unwelcome shroud, seeping beyond the generous layers of your kimono to settle deep within. Your breath drifted slowly before you, dissipating in gentle clouds that blurred the space between you and the gray morning air. The spear felt heavier in your grasp now, its bitter chill anchoring your focus amid the fragile cloak of silence. The faint knock against the wood lingered in your mind, a persistent echo that refused to fade. Ahead, the corridor stretched narrow and shadowed, shadow and light grappling quietly like restless spirits unwilling to yield. Your bare feet pressed softly into the frozen earth, the uneven grains a muted drum beneath your cautious steps, the subtle creaks of old timber and the faint rustle of straw blended with the distant breaths of your comrades, as if the barracks itself held its breath alongside you. Each sound was sharpened, magnified by the oppressive quiet that surrounded you. Your fingers tightened reflexively on the spear, the cold ridges a sharp contrast against your slowing pulse. The whetstone's faint rasp from deeper within the camp played a quiet rhythm, a stubborn defiance against the creeping decay of fatigue. You allowed the ritual to steady you, slow, deliberate strokes of preparation, each measured motion a thread weaving you through the heavy isolation. The air shifted, carrying with it a sharper edge, the acrid sting of unsettled smoke mixing with the damp earth, wrapped in the raw scent of cold metal, and something darker, unspeakably old. You swallowed cautiously, the bitter tang clinging to your tongue like a lingering warning. Fingers tracing the leather straps, their chill biting softly against your wrists. You adjusted your armor's embrace, mindful of every tightening stitch that bound you to readiness. Your eyes flicked to the camp's edge, where shadows twisted and dissolved in the mist. Shapes moved with languid care, deliberately slow and measured, like memories slipping between grasp and forgetfulness. The frost blanketed the earth silently, the soft crunch beneath your feet, an intimate reminder of each passing moment's weight. A mournful caw shattered the stillness, the crow's solitary cry stabbing the thick fog with sudden awareness. Your senses sharpened instantly, the tiny hairs on your neck pricking like whispers, reaching from unseen places. The faintest movement caught your gaze, a slow, fluid silhouette retreating softly behind a gnarled tree, vanishing like smoke dissolving into a dawn too pale to hold warmth. As your grip steadied, the spear, once merely cold wood and iron, transformed in your hands into a lifeline, woven with the weight of silent vigilance. You stepped forward carefully, the mossy ground yielding faintly underfoot, its moss soft but chilled, a fragile contrast to the unyielding frost so near. The day's muted light cast thin tendrils through the gathering fog, painting frost crystals like scattered diamonds caught in tangled roots and brittle leaves. You bent low briefly, hesitating as your fingers brushed the crystalline blades, the sharpness both beautiful and cold, a delicate razor reminding you of all that slipped through the cracks of survival. The camp murmured anew, a tapestry of quiet urgency, woven with whispered orders and lowered voices. Embers glimmered faintly in the shrinking fire pits, casting a brief, tremulous glow that barely fought back the encroaching gray. You inhaled deep, catching the scent of pine resin, thick with moisture, mingled with the subtle trace of iron and a smoky undertone that clung like a secret. Ahead, the narrow path opened wider into a dim clearing hemmed by skeletal branches that seemed to reach with twisted fingers at the sky's oppressive stillness. The mist threaded through the bare limbs, drifting like slow fingers tracing the contours of unease. Your steps softened as you advanced, the earth beneath holding firm, yet slick with unseen frost patches. Each footfall was a quiet statement against the all-consuming hush. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the calm, a twig snapping crisp and final beneath unseen weight. Instantly, your muscles coiled, each movement deliberate, restrained. The spear's cold presence hummed in your palm, a steady pulse, holding darkness at bay. Your eyes searched the gray periphery, catching a flicker, a swift shadow, melting through the haze, fluid and deliberate. Weaving between tree trunks like a slow breath slipping from the world. You held your breath, time stretching thin as the figure paused in the gloom, fleeting and indistinct as a half-remembered dream. Then it melted away again, consumed by the heavy mist as though it had never been. The fragile safety you had held dissolved into tension now, thickening like the fog pressing against your skin. Somewhere just beyond the clearing, murmurs rose more forcefully, urgent whispers threading through the veil of dawn. Torches sparked, flames licking the cold with tentative tongues, their golden glow trembling on the edges of shadow. Your gaze fell to the path leading deeper into the thicket, untouched and solemn. The moss carpet softened with each careful step, the scent of damp stone and pine resin weaving through the cold air. Beneath it lingered a darker fragrance, the subtle curl of danger hiding just out of sight. A sudden breath of wind rattled dry branches, sending a scatter of frost crystals like fleeting stars dancing in a frozen web. The dim light thinned further, folding into shadow, as the cant's restless murmurs wove the creeping urgency tighter around you. Then, from the silence, a deliberate knock, a soft rap upon weathered wood, resounded once. Then, again, a measured summon that lingered, echoing quietly, like a heartbeat swallowed by the gathering gloom. You froze, every sense drawn taut as the world held its breath once more. Beyond the thin timber, through the thickening fog, a shape emerged slowly, patient, watchful, closing the distance like a shadow carried on the cold wind. And as that slow, inexorable presence stepped forward, the faintest glimmer of steel caught the dying light, slicing through the mist like a secret whisper that refused to stay buried. You waited in that suspended moment, the cold pressing close, your breath a fragile mist hanging longer than before. The quiet that had folded itself around the camp like a shroud finally gave way, not with the clash of steel or the roar of battle, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps advancing through the fog. From the fading shadows emerged figures, careful and measured, their shapes solidifying beneath the weak dawn light. Not enemies, but faces marked with weariness, relief, and the faintest glimmer of hope. The quiet summons had been an unexpected signal, an emissary from a neighboring unit, arriving just in time to break the heavy stillness that had gripped you all. They bore word that the siege weighing on your camp was lifting, that reinforcements had arrived, and the tide was finally turning. The long hours of waiting and watching, the endless ritual of preparation, had reached their breaking point. You lowered your spear slowly, feeling the cold metal soften in your palm, a symbolic release of the tension knotting your muscles. Around you, the barracks began to stir with cautious life, voices rising in low, tired conversation, and the shifting movements of comrades suddenly awake to the promise of change. Your hands, still rough and stained from the night's labor, relaxed as the first faint warmth of the sun reached through the fog, spilling golden light across the frozen earth. Outside, the mist started to lift, revealing the familiar contours of the camp. Worn tents, buckling under the weight of winter, scattered weapons, resting in quiet repose, and the skeletal branches of trees etched pale against the sky. The burden that had pressed unyielding upon your shoulders seemed to ebb, leaving a calm beneath the aching exhaustion. You felt the cold begin to recede, replaced by the soft kiss of sunlight thawing your skin, coaxing warmth back into fingers stiff from the damp chill. The damp straw beneath your feet no longer felt like an enemy, but a humble reminder of the endurance it had witnessed. The quiet murmur of the campfires, once fading embers, flickered anew as tender flames claimed life from the ashes. Around you, your comrades shed the heavy cloaks of fear and weariness, their faces catching the light as small smiles broke through. Some exchanged wordless nods, a shared understanding of the long road traveled, and the uncertain path still ahead, but a path no longer shadowed only by waiting. You found a place to sit, your bare feet pressing into the earth that, despite its chill, now hummed with renewed promise. Your breath slowed, no longer a fog of despair, but a gentle rhythm, matching the morning's quiet heartbeat. The ritual of survival, once a burdensome litany, felt less like a chain and more like the steady pulse of life itself, fragile yet unbroken. The spear rested beside you, its promise fulfilled not through the strike of battle this day, but through the endurance it had symbolized. Each scar, each scrape of metal against stone, the tightening of leather straps, all spoke of resilience, the quiet strength that held the camp together in moments when hope was scarce. As the sun rose further, casting long shadows that softened into warm hues, you allowed your eyes to close briefly. The cold no longer bit quite so sharply. The camp's breath, once so heavily weighted with dread, now sighed softly in the embrace of a new day. In that calm, you let the tension release fully, muscles relaxing with the knowledge that the unseen threat had passed, the waiting was over, and the silent vigil had borne fruit. The stirrings of war still whispered beyond the horizon, but here, in this fragile refuge wrapped in dawn's gentle light, peace had settled. For now, you imagined the coming days, quiet moments between the echoes, small acts of rebuilding amidst the ruins of hardship. The taste of rice no longer bitter with hunger, but seasoned with relief. The cold beams of moonlight that would no longer feel like a creeping shadow, but a hush before rest. Your thoughts drifted slowly, no longer tangled with fear, but softened by the steady cadence of survival and the quiet promise of renewal. The enduring silence had taught you much, that strength often lives in stillness, that hope can be found between breaths, and that each dawn, no matter how gray or cold, carries the possibility of warmth. with the soft rustle of movement around you, the low murmur of returning life, and the fading mist curling like a whispered farewell. You surrendered fully to the peace of this moment. The long night was over. Rustling straw, chilled earth, and the lingering scent of smoke faded gently into the background as your eyes closed. The cold breath of winter giving way to the warm embrace of rest. The quiet deepened, a soothing canopy woven of light and shadow, carrying you slowly towards sleep. Here, amidst the fragile calm of a world renewed, you found the stillness you had sought, a breath held and finally released, a story folded softly into silence, and with that, the world faded away, inviting you to rest, knowing you had lived through the coldest dawn and emerged into the gentle light of a new beginning.